I am now going to paraphrase one of my favourite recent discoveries on YouTube, a channel called AVE, who put words to my sentiments far more eloquently than I ever could. Here we go. I can and will at times in this video be colourful and salty in my phrasing and language. I really couldn't give two licks of a frozen penis which particular brand of puritanism you've been infected with. And as I am neither sitting at your mother's dining table nor have you hired me as entertainment for your spunk demon's birthday party, I would suggest if you are offended by words, please remember and use the red X in the corner of the screen. Now let's give the arseholes a few seconds to face roll an angry comment and downvote the video. Hello dear viewer, pull a seat close, lube up and make yourself comfortable, because in this video I'm going deep and long. It's axiomatic that stereotypes are false when applied to a group with a broad brush. However, from that axiom it would be naive to assume that there are not multitudes of each particular stereotype within every group. Take gamers for example. To the outside world, gamers appear as an angry diabetic monolith encased in the crusted remnants of last night's incognito browsing. On the inside a different picture emerges. You see dear viewer, gamers are a heterogeneous although strictly stratified group, from the vilest of the console players who exist to play Call of Lootbox Modern Warfare 10, to the casual tablet gamers who buy Apple products because they're fiercely individualistic mavericks like all of their suburbanite friends. You have the MMO and hero shooter players obsessed with balance, and of course the milsim players who are either in possession of too many chromosomes to enter the military or are disgraced former soldiers trying to relive their formative years, minus of course the sexual indiscretion involving the goat herder's son that prematurely brought their career to an end. Need I mention the narcissistic cocksnufflers who exclusively play grand strategy games while trying to convince the world, had I been at Napoleon's side things would have been different. Then we come to simulations. Now let's be very fucking clear on this. Train and truck simmers can go suck a bag of rotting cocks. You only need to have two eyes, two working arms and basic brainstem function to drive a fucking train. Pull the brake when you see people or cars on the tracks and you're on the big money. And we all know truck sim players are either real truckers just searching for the quietest sections of road to dump a dead prostitute, or proto-serial prostitute murderers practicing for the boring shit between victims. There are so many simulation types out there. We have racing sims, sailing sims, soaring sims, space sims, tank sims, submarine sims. There's even a get a geisha to swallow your load sim, and a gay daddy sim. Oh my. In this endeavour, Microsoft are attempting to catch as many of the aforementioned in a single net, with one game, or sim, to rule them all. First, a little history. Microsoft have been developing flight simulators since Flight Simulator 1.0 came out in 1982. People have been playing Microsoft flight simulators longer than they've been swearing at Windows. Like Windows, there have been many ups and downs along the way, but as anyone who has ever tried to use any other operating system for gaming, video creation and general computing will tell you, Windows fucking works. There you go Microsoft, you can have that one for free. The last and 12th iteration of the program, FSX, meaning Flight Simulator 10, was by far the most popular, even though it did prove that Microsoft couldn't count with their fucking shoes on. Flight Simulator was Microsoft's baby. Unfortunately, more than a quarter of a century postpartum, this baby showed absolutely no signs of growing up. It was completely incontinent, bloated and demanding. Microsoft understandably grew weary of their offspring and allowed Dovetail Games to adopt it. FSX Steam Edition was released, followed by Flight Simulator World. As you can probably tell by the tone of my voice, the results paralleled Gary Glitter's efforts to adopt a child in Vietnam, in the sense that both were examples where the adoptee got fucked. To be fair to those developing flight sims, the hobby has become very niche since its heyday in the late 90s, so much so that many would rather admit to being a furry that engages in bestiality and occasional scat play than admit to being a flight simmer. Then at Microsoft's E3 2019 presentation, something actually happened that people were really interested in. Normally these are embarrassing affairs where Microsoft employees pretend to be hip, rad, groovy and wizard, nervously glancing at the audience every time they mention binging something, while the audience looks on with glazed eyes in the vain hope that a lone angry sniper will find his mark and put them out of our misery. But this time they had something. The world was ready for a new messiah, and that messiah was Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 from Microsoft and Asobo. Who the fuck are Asobo anyway? It sounds like a village my great-great-great-uncle Horatio Laube discovered in 1847 while attempting to be the first European to fuck his way to the source of the Zambezi. Alas, he was beaten by syphilis and 2 Norwegians. Henceforth in this video they shall be known as Asbo. Flight sim devs always post minimum specs. Follow them at your peril because they only do that to fuck with you. The real minimum specs are recommended specs. For those of you new to flight sims, if you go minimum specs, it's going to run like a foot chase between Boogie 2988 and Wings of Redemption, and look twice as bad. No doubt some of you are saying, but my specs match the ideal specs. I'll be able to turn everything up to ultra. Oh, you poor naive fucker. In every other genre that would be true, but in flight sims things are different. It will look something like it does in the ads, in the same way Conchita Wurst looks something like Beyonce. Here are my specs so you can use this video as a reference. Oh, and please ignore those old fuckers who frequent forums that only funeral directors and dignitas will take advertising on. They will try to tell you 30 frames a second is acceptable, maybe for the silent porn they grew up on, but not in the fucking flight sim. So what else do you need? Well, you need something to control the bloody thing. You can play with a HOTAS, yoke, joystick, mouse and keyboard, Xbox controller, and no doubt some industrious prick will probably make a video using a Guitar Hero controller to fly a 747. Whatever you do, for the love of all that is unholy, buy yourself a cheap joystick and maybe even a cheap set of rudder pedals. Playing a flight sim with anything else is like trying to get your favourite sanding toy up your urethra while cycling down a gravel road. In the stuff you should get rather than the stuff you absolutely need category, you should get yourself a cheap-ass head tracking device like a Delang clip. In conjunction with a free program called OpenTrack, this will open up the world of head tracking with 6 degrees of freedom, and will absolutely change your flight simming experience for the better. Now you've converted your masturbation station into a flight training centre, or you're viewing from the future on one of those wanky new Xboned Ones X. You've just downloaded FlightSim 2020 because you're banned off every Call of Duty server due to your wailing cum sprouts, and your vociferous belief that your sister wife deserves to have equal rights, lefts and uppercuts. It's time to set up your controls, so what's that like in FlightSim 2020? When it comes to ease of control setup, one sim stands head and shoulders above the rest. That's a military flight sim called DCS. They arrange all the assignments into rows and the controls into columns. That way you can press any button on any controller and immediately tell at a glance what it's set to. In fairness to Microsoft and ASBO, they appear to have started down that route, but were distracted by jangling keys and left it at that. It's not perfect and certainly not as frustrating as other sims I could mention. IL2. It's like the slow intern at the office was asked to copy the DCS control scheme but stuck his last crayon up his arse before he could complete the task. A bit of arseache to be sure, but nothing that's going to make you fillet to 38. If you haven't quit in frustration during the control setup minigame, congratulations. Now let's take a look at the realism settings. If you're a casual player who has no experience of either flight sims or real-world flying, pick an easier difficulty scale to get accustomed. It's your game, be you, and don't let any other cocksucker ruin your experience. However, if you have experience of either real-world or sim flight, or if you want to learn in a realistic environment, then ramp up the difficulty and take your time. I have to give kudos to Microsoft and ASBO here. They've put together a good range of settings to suit everyone from the casual to the hardcore simmer. I would recommend to those who want a realistic experience to turn off the training wheels, suck for a while, go balls deep on bagged, and enjoy the little victories of getting one's shit together. It's a great feeling, but when all's said and done, it's your game. Enjoy it as you please. Your controls are set up and you're ready to fly, right? Wrong. You need to pay a quick visit to the graphics settings. You can let the sim choose everything for you, but you run the risk of everything looking like bottled shite. The trick here is to tweak as many settings as you can to make it look as beautiful as you can in exchange for negligible losses in performance. Your mileage may vary, but it's well worth diving in and trying out different settings to get the best experience you can. I have to congratulate Microsoft and ASBO in the realms of graphics settings. They've thought of everything and done their homework well. Another feature of this sim is the ability to have live and online traffic. This means you will have real-world flights and aircraft taking off and landing in your sim. You may also have the scum and villainy that comprises the online population, buzzing the tower and taking off and landing on taxiways like fucking Harrison Ford. You can set the density of airport vehicles, airport workers, road vehicles and ships. These are obviously not live, but give it time. There's no point in sugarcoating this. To enjoy this sim to the fullest, you're going to need a pretty decent uncapped data connection. If your internet is third world quality, it's going to stop, stutter and stall every time it tries to load scenery. Out of pure frustration, you're going to end up switching to autogen, and autogen in this sim looks like autogen in every other civilian sim. Pure bollocks. Yes, you have the ability to save data to a cache, but if you have a low quality internet connection, it should be a deal breaker for you in this sim. There are lots of things you can do in the sim, challenges and activities for the intrepid, training for the virgins. There's even a marketplace if you've an overwhelming disdain for the contents of your wallet. But that's not the real reason anyone buys a civilian flight sim. The first thing everyone wants to do is fly over their own house, and if that house isn't there, or the couch, pyramid of beer cans and clapped out washing machine aren't present in the front yard, then the forums, Reddit and everywhere else that mouth breathers congeal upon will be clogged with the menstrual blood of middle-aged men distilled into the bitter retarded prose of betrayal, usually reserved for emails to the local council every time their favourite rent boy district comes up for rezoning. On the surface, the world map looks like the standard fare you see in every other civilian flight sim. However, underneath the hood there are a few things that'll get your nerve boner a-throbbing. The first one is, at the click of a mouse you can see the live arrivals and departures of any airport you select. Granted, it's only useful if you're watching out for your girlfriend's flight so you can pay the hookers and get them out the door before she arrives. But there are actually some useful under-the-hood features. There's a section called Filters. You can use this to set up a variety of parameters. You can check wind at different levels, cloud coverage, precipitation, where your friends are crashing. Only joking, you don't have any, that's why you're playing a flight sim. You can also view airspaces, nav aids, and a whole host of other pertinent information. Of course, if you just want to fly, all you have to do is choose your aircraft, choose the airport closest to your stinking hovel, and select departure. I'm now going to take a deep dive on terrain. How close it's going to look to your local area is going to depend very much on where you live. If you live in the US or Europe, you've a better chance of being pleased. Australia and New Zealand are good, but some things are missing. Definitely better than previous sims though. I'm now going to take a deep dive on different areas from all over the globe. I'm not going to fly over my house, but I may end up flying over some of your houses. So if you see your house in the video, please let me know in the comments and I'll be suitably fucking unimpressed. I'm going to start by taking a look at some parts of Northern Europe. Ireland overall looks pretty good, definitely better than any other sim, although fuck knows why they handcrafted the provincial airport instead of one of the international ones. There are areas where two different sections of the map are joined at two different seasons. Full disclosure here, Ireland only has two seasons, cold, miserable and pissing rain, slightly less cold, just as miserable but more rain. Alcoholism isn't so much an Irish problem as it is a weather problem. Obviously, because of the desire to fool Americans into visiting, they refer to one of those seasons as summer. And don't be fooled by the natives wearing summer clothes. Like Newcastle in England, it's down more to dogged optimism than any real reflection of the temperature. Dublin is a low-rise city and therefore quite uninteresting from the air. Probably due to repressed memories of their education at the hands of priests, city planners have a backward and illogical phobia of skyscrapers. The UK, like Ireland, looks pretty good overall, with parts of Scotland, Wales and the Isle of Man being exceptions. Welcome to Bing Maps. On the flip side, London looks fantastic. Some buildings are not quite correct. However, you've got a nice Millennium Dome, or whatever the fuck they call it now, Tower Bridge and the Shard. The Gherkin, nestled in a group of buildings just north of Tower Bridge here, looks abysmal. Of course, there are a bunch of pricks already lining up to sell you scenery to cover it. Speaking of pricks, people say the Gherkin looks like a giant penis, but personally I think that's a fallacy. Below we have the Houses of Parliament, after which the most delicious condiment known to man is named. My only gripe thus far is that some of the handcrafted buildings look too different from the surrounding buildings, making them stand out like an erection in a tracksuit. Moving to another part of the UK now, the Channel Islands look amazingly detailed and realistic. I suppose if Microsoft management are contractually obliged to rely on Bing Maps, they need to be able to find the fucking banks in an offshore tax haven. Moving on to France, I chose not to cover Paris, as I know most of the inbred unwashed will be doing circles around the Eiffel Tower and barnstorming the Arc de Triomphe, while bemoaning the lack of bicycles, onions and striped sweaters. I'm avoiding Bordeaux because Asbo are based there, so we all know it's going to look like a waxed and bejazzled Quinn. As a result, I chose a place closer to my heart, Strasbourg. The city itself looks great, but there are a few parts of the surrounding rural areas that look a bit FSXy. And for those of you who are new to flight simming, please remember there's nothing sexy about FSXy. Moving on to the Netherlands, well, they're as flat as a witch's tit, so not much of a challenge here for a pilot apart from staying awake. However, it does possess its own unique flat charm and beauty, and is one of my favourite countries. Amsterdam looks okay, but with the exception of Central Station, the buildings don't look handcrafted. Oh, and you can see just up here that the AI has drawn its own conclusions as to what a houseboat is. When all's said and done, the city does look like the one I know. For example, just to the left off the nose is the red light district, where for a couple of €100 you can pay an obese African lady to violate you with a strap-on while an S&M midget plays Knowing Me, Knowing You on a ukulele in the corner. In the sim, Denmark is a bit of a mixed bag. Parts of Copenhagen, as you can see here, look great, while other parts look a little bit like FSX. Bing again. While flying over this rather wealthy looking neighbourhood by the coast, I'm reminded that there are still some poor unfortunate fuckwits on this planet who have never heard of hedgerows. It's not like they're not all over northwestern Europe. These poor unfortunates dwell in US cube farms, and when an aerial photo of a rural area or city suburb appears on their screen, they look at the low green lines dividing fields and properties thinking, fuck me, that's a lot of midget trees. So you end up with what you see here, trees, trees and more trees. Yes, in real life these roads are lined with trees, placed about 50 metres apart. There are some in gardens, but not lined up in rows so the inhabitants would need jetpacks to get to their fucking doors. On a serious note, if you're a sim developer and find a way of making hedgerows a reality, I'll suck your dick. On second thoughts, maybe I'll go all medieval and send a champion in my stead. It's not like the flight sim world is suffering from a cocksucker drought at the moment. But either way, I'll owe you a Hummer. One area where the sim is rather consistent, and not in a good way, is bridges. Here the AI has apparently forgotten the bridge to Malmo, or perhaps it's been swallowed up by the rising tide of global warming and I've installed an alpha of FS 2050. Gibraltar reminds you that at the heart of it all you are just streaming ortho scenery. For the new people, ortho scenery are commonly referred to as satellite photos. In cities they're mostly just aerial photos downloaded from either Google Maps or in this case Bing. Older sims came with standard auto-generated scenery that looked plainer than your spinster aunt, so you could either buy third-party scenery from a dev or download ortho tiles and place building and landmarks on top. This was a tedious task which took gigabytes of space, so notwithstanding how shit it looks in places, it is rather refreshing to have it built in. In some places the AI picks up the slack and does an excellent job, but unfortunately in Gibraltar its limitations come to the fore. With ortho scenery and overlays there have always been issues placing roads next to sharply rising gradients, and unfortunately the AI hasn't picked this up. This often leads to almost comical results like cars speeding up 90-degree cliffs and apartment buildings growing out of digital landslides. I wouldn't mind, but they put one of those, well, hello sailor stars next to it on the map. The airport and rock look great, but the rest of Gibraltar is very much like its major demographic, in the fact that it looks old and stinks of shit. Barcelona is very much a tale of two cities. The outskirts look like FS 2004 or FSX. There are a multitude of huge monoliths and not much else. Then, just as I was about to quit, call somebody at Microsoft and tell them to suck my fat one, I passed through some kind of space-time barrier. The beach area and city centre looked amazing. I wouldn't mind, but they've put another of those fucking, well, hello sailor stars next to Barcelona too. With just a little more attention to detail around the airport and docks, and this city would have been outstanding. Well, looks like they've binged it again. I'm starting to think Bing is a euphemism invented by some Bible thumper from the deep south who believes the word fuck will cause him irreparable psychic harm. You know the type, the more angry they become the more they channel Yosemite Sam. Did you bing her last night, son? Oh yeah, Pa, I most certainly did. I binged her in every hole like you told me. Oh, Bing, son, your mama'd be so proud if she hadn't run off with that binger of a NASCAR driver. On the flip side, Palermo looks amazing. With its winding streets, it has that largely unplanned charm of an ancient Italian city. The road layout in the sim is very convincing. Even though the buildings are not exactly correct, it's unmistakable as Palermo. Somewhere down there's a guy in the market still selling DVDs of all Shakespeare's works, remade to the highest production values you'll ever find in a fuck flick. But don't go around asking about the mafia here, you'll find yourself in the harbour feeding the fish. Speaking of the harbour, it appears the AI went all Armageddon here and began constructing a Borg seafaring vessel. When it came to the Greek islands, there was just one place I had to visit. I've watched a lot of gut-wrenching documentaries online about the lives of the women from this island. It looks okay in the sim, although much wilder and less landscape than I anticipated. And considering the strict diet of its inhabitants, I expected there to be way more fishing villages. Asia is a bit of a lucky dip. A lucky dip that only contains sparkling diamonds and used condoms. Thankfully, Tokyo is a sparkling diamond. It's gorgeous, as is most of Japan. It's so realistic looking, it looks like you could land here, sniff a pair of used panties from a vending machine and then go for a soapy titty wank at the nearest soapland. It looks that real. Oh, and if you ever visit Tokyo for real, ask at any small restaurant or bar for a secret local dish called manko. It's my favourite, you won't be disappointed. Encouraged by Japan, I couldn't wait to try Taiwan. I started at the beautiful Taroko Gorge in Hualien, but it looked like I had purchased the super duper pixel art version. Not one to be defeated, I tried Taidong, but like the rest of the beautiful eastern side of the island, it was fucked to hell and back. The jungle that sweeps down to the sea was sparse and badly done, leaving it looking like fucking Wales. Just with nicer beaches and less terrified sheep, of course. I figured okay, they fucked up everything else, at least they'd have to have done a decent job of Taipei. Was I wrong? They did model the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall, but completely forgot to model Taipei 101, one of the 10 tallest buildings in the world. Out of sheer exasperation, we ended up where we are now, Tainan, which only bears a passing resemblance to the real thing. To be honest, I haven't been as disappointed since I mixed up Bruce's Campbell and Jenner, and sat down to watch what I thought was a documentary about the changing life of the cool guy from the Evil Dead series. I decided to travel north across the strait to see what I found there. Suzhou, a Chinese Venice, is again much more beautiful in reality than in the sim. Perhaps without your wings getting stuck in the smog and the dawn chorus of people gobbing in the street, it didn't seem like the place I remember, although the accuracy here is better than most parts of China. It's about 90 kilometers inland from Shanghai and a much more interesting place. It's well worth seeing before it changes again, as beautiful cities in China seem to change every 15 years, deleting everything that was individualistic or charming and replacing it with the latest kitsch, like your local knocking shop putting up their Christmas decorations. I couldn't leave Asia without visiting Pyongyang in North Korea. Fucking hell, it looks bleak in this sim. The realism is unparalleled. Incidentally, does anyone else have Kim Yo-jong on their wood-bang bucket list? Maybe it's just me, but the thought of facing a firing squad if I didn't fully satisfy her turns me on. It's pretty much fucking for one's life. We're starting off in Africa by taking a look at Cape Town, with Table Mountain looming over the city like impending danger. The harbour's fairly detailed, and there are a couple of kilometres of beautiful coast. You know you're in Cape Town rather than Johannesburg, because when you look out the cockpit window there aren't two guys trying to pry the tyres off the landing gear while their friend threatens to give you AIDS. The parts of South Africa I've looked at look pretty decent. Certainly not outstanding, but not the disappointment that parts of Asia were. My next stop on the African leg of the map was Ethiopia, with its ancient highlands, history going back to antiquity and beyond, and of course its beautiful women. Its capital, Addis Ababa, looks pretty decent in the sim. Due to its altitude of nearly 2,500 metres, when proper GA aircraft with complex systems arrive in the marketplace, this will be a challenging and interesting place to fly. If you're looking for express landing clearance at Entebbe, turn off your landing and navigation lights, and then make sure you use the correct greeting, which is Shalom Entebbe Tower. The airport looks pretty good, but unfortunately we're let down by aerial photography in the area. Nearby Kampala looks good enough in parts, but terrible in others, just like the real thing, eh? Unfortunately, where it really goes downhill are the rural areas, where it seems one has more of a chance of being savaged by those fucking pigmen from Minecraft than by lions. The Canary Islands in this sim are a bit like Tinder in the sense that the first beautiful vista you experience reels you in. However, it's not long before it all turns hideously ugly as you realise that, like your prospective Tinder date, some of the ortho photos here haven't been touched up in at least 2 decades. In fairness to the devs, the AI is doing its best here. The Canaries have a reputation as a resort and party destination, with singles and families going in summer and some of the biggest gay parties taking place in October. Don't you think they missed a marketing opportunity by not renaming it Cocktober? The islands are beautiful in some places and raggedy-arsed in others, leaving a mixed impression. I found some parts of Australia and New Zealand to be really beautiful, some parts a bit of a mixed bag and some parts a little bit rough. Auckland here falls into the second category rather than the first or third. It looks good enough, but I'm not sure how much the sunrise is enhancing that. There are other areas like Sydney where they do an amazing job until you get to the Opera House and realise they've forgotten the fucking bridge. It's little obvious things like that that make me think they should have held on another couple of months and really polished this sim. So overall, if you're looking to have some Antipodean aeronautical adventures, it's pretty good, but it could have been a lot better. The Falkland Islands are a pretty bleak and uninteresting place, unless of course you're a military junta who need an even more remote place to keep war criminals out of the reach of the Mossad, or a president with autocratic tendencies and need to take the minds of the peasants away from the tanking economy. Then it can be the most interesting fucking place on the planet. With its curious looking locals, whom I am told are not actually inbred, but are in fact actively evolving those webbed feet they're famed for so they can compete with the local penguin colonies for fishing rights. Alas, it's also untrue that penguin colonies fall over like dominoes when overflown. The Falklands in this sim represents ortho scenery at its most average, but let's face it, who the fuck wants to go to the Falklands? Rio is amazing in this sim, with the statue of Charles Manson arms outstretched urging his followers to kill all the pigs, the favelas sweeping from his feet down the hillsides to the business districts as wealth and ostentation grow proportionally with proximity to the ocean. It's absolutely gorgeous in this sim. It feels like one could almost reach out the window and retrieve a refreshing bag of pilot powder. In other sims I had to download ortho scenery and place Manson manually, so this is really outstanding for me. I can't praise Rio enough here. In fact, it made me so happy that I remembered a little piece of local trivia. A Brazilian bikini wax is not called a Brazilian here, the locals call it a Hitler, and that's incredibly apt when one considers it's the shorn, squared off hair above the lips of a cunt. St. Martin is very disappointing, particularly considering it's regarded as one of the more popular areas to take off and land in the Caribbean, mainly due to there being no shortage of fuckwits wishing to get blasted into the sea by a jet engine. I have a suggestion for those of you planning such an endeavour. Why not just stand forward of the engine, you oxygen thief? At least it'll give the rest of us a good laugh as you spray your window-licking friends in a delightfully red emulsion. Neighbouring St. Bartholomew has a big star next to it, and the airport looks great. Pity the rest of the island looks like something one would expect to see after dipping into the laudanum bottle once too often. I had great hopes and wishes for Nassau, but as my old grandmother used to say, wish in one hand, shit in the other, see which one fills up first. As soon as I got off the ground, I realised the rest of the island was going to look like they'd hired Pablo Picasso himself. I avoided Haiti as I didn't want to catch fuck flu, so instead I gave Jamaica a shot. Kingston looks fantastic. You've no idea how happy that makes me, as I love reggae and have nothing but the deepest respect for anyone who can make a spliff a religious rite. On a related subject, people often ask me, Lau B, why do you spend Sunday wandering around Tesco swigging from an Auchentoshan bottle and sporadically pulling your wire in the magazine aisle? It's my faith, and that's Pastor Lau B, you fucking heathen. I'm tenuously reaching for the hope that as, now please don't laugh, Bing Maps improve, maybe we'll get the Caribbean we deserve. I got lucky this time with New York. It's normally teeming with window lickers flying to and fro between buildings like they're in fucking Coruscant. It's usually, oh, there goes Charlie Uniform November Tango doing another loop and face planting into Central Park. Someone please give that fucker a real plane so we can increase the depth of the gene pool a little. New York looks absolutely gorgeous. It provides a great insight into what this sim is capable of. It's so realistic you can almost imagine little digital people in those little digital cars calling each other little digital cocksuckers at every junction. While I wrap up this piece on terrain, we're going to visit the source of many a Sunday wank being interrupted by impeccably mannered, immaculately presented, amiable, attractive Americans selling faith door to door like it were clothes pegs. Don't get me wrong, they're always charming, but I ask you, what sort of person leaves a man's helmet semi-polished without so much as offering to finish him off with a quick gum rumble? Arguably, there are two unique selling points for FS 2020. The first of these is the high-quality ortho scenery. This is given a pass by the Black Shark AI, which is designed to intelligently place buildings. If you want to achieve this effect in any other civilian sim, you either have to download the ortho scenery and place buildings manually, or buy a scenery pack from a third party. They have done an excellent job, and where available the quality of the terrain is very high. But just a friendly reminder, we are using Bing Maps, a place less visited than Kanye West's bookshelf, and only visited at all because every time a Microsoft employee fails to plan their route home using Bing Maps, middle management throw another litter of kittens into the wood chipper. Don't get me wrong, with the above said, Bing Maps aren't all that bad. I wouldn't be relying on it to plan an invasion of North Korea, or even my daily sojourn to the Poom Pushers, but in some rare places its quality almost overtakes Google Maps. Almost. Unfortunately, those are places I have no intention of visiting and wouldn't fly over them with a B-52 full of horse jip. The airports look great. Even the off-the-shelf, non-handcrafted ones have the runways, taxiways and buildings in roughly the correct locations. What the fuck is handcrafted anyway? It conjures up visions of little elves making models from matchsticks, lovingly painting and weathering them, or children in the third world intricately stitching the logo on your running shoes, or soldering the resistors in your iPhone. It's none of the above though. At its heart, it's just copy-pasting 3D buildings in the correct place. There are monkeys who see this task as two full stages below flinging their feces at other monkeys. From now on, when you hear the phrase handcrafted, understand the phrase. In between his primary roles of making coffee and changing the car battery on the office manager's testicle clamps, we had our second least capable intern paste in some 3D models. Then we had our least capable intern carefully look them over. He's a good guy, highly motivated and saving hard for that cataract surgery. The interns have a lot to be proud of. They did a great job, and in many places it was so good it had me handcrafting, vigorously. There are many places that are really impressive, particularly around airports. They even have those things. I forget what they're called. You know, those things in the high-vis vests that see the fragile label on your guitar case as a personal challenge to turn the contents into matches. I remember now. They're called fuckheads.
Cessna X-ray Golf Sierra, acknowledge last transmission.
Sorry about that. It will wash off. The other major selling point of the sim is out of the box you have real world weather. So if you're flying in the British Isles it's going to be pissing rain, but the clouds look amazing, the sky, the colours, it makes the sim stand head and shoulders above its competitors, at least in the sense of weather. There aren't enough superlatives in the English language to adequately laud the weather in this sim. Most sims look great during the golden hour, just around sunrise, sunset and at night. This sim looks amazing all the time. The clouds cast dynamic shadows and create a vista that actually transports you to the place being represented in the tiny pixels. The rain effects on the windshields, particularly heavy rain, are just exquisite. It still has a little of that sim look that has me convinced that the only liquid that any flight sim developer has seen is the liquid that you buy at the weekend when using the tradesman's entrance. But listen to the sound of it pelting the canopy. Look on the ground, it's wetter than your girlfriend watching a basketball team. They've thought of everything. Thunderstorms are nicely done, there's even some decent audio depending on proximity. You shouldn't be flying a wanky little Cessna in a thunderstorm, but you're not really flying anything. You're sitting in your hovel, just killing time while recharging the pink pummeler between binges of the latest deep-fake Deep Throat starring Kim Yo-jong and Dennis Rodman. The icing effects begin almost imperceptibly, slowly creeping across your windshield, but before you know it, your vision will be gooed up like the ugly girl's face at a gangbang. When it snows, the buildings, roofs, fields and everything else are covered in snow. The foliage still desperately clings to summer with both hands like your dad after a ketamine binge at the local glory hole, but it's still quite convincing. The weather is not just visual, you get blown around a bit. There are some very realistic representations of airflow around mountains, which are the most realistic I've encountered in a sim. You also get a little taste of this around cities, rivers, coasts and forests. However, before Microsoft do themselves a serious spinal injury trying to suck their own dicks, general flight conditions are a lot more tame than they should be. They haven't correctly captured the effect of wind on a small aircraft, it all feels rather scripted and rehearsed. And it's certainly not up to the level of the other established civil aviation sim. By way of example, I flew a Robin Dior 400 into Typhoon Bavi, a sport aircraft made of wood. This Typhoon fucked North Korea like the Kim family. I should have been penetrated, violated and mangled like a drunk prep school boy encountering a horny rugby team. But nothing. I felt as safe as if I were having a leisurely tug on my couch while watching the latest war on the news. The sea looked magnificently menacing, but all I got from it was a deep feeling of empathy for your girlfriend. Because like you, the weather here didn't even touch the sides. I'm not quite sure if this belongs in flight and systems modelling, but I'll get to that later. The aircraft that come with FS 2020 are what is known as survey simulations rather than study simulations. Those of you who are new to all this will be screaming like a geriatric watching a political debate at your screen. What the fuck are you talking about, Lobby? What's all this study shit? Calm down, dear imaginary viewer, I'll explain. A study level aircraft goes into every detail of an aircraft, from startup to systems to failures. You would have to follow much the same procedures and checklists as a real pilot. A survey level aircraft is a dumbed down version, with all systems not modelled. This happens to a greater or lesser degree depending on the developer. If you imagine the study sim as being Christian Bale, then you can imagine the survey sim as being Tom Cruise. In this sim there are lots of aircraft to choose from. As far as I can discern, you can perform a cold and dark startup in all of them, just not to the same level as one would in the real thing. At the moment there seem to be no consequences for missing steps or performing steps out of sequence, such as fucking up your electrics, radios or engine as you would in real life. For example, in real life in the Cessna 172, if you turn on the radio stack before you start the engines, you will blow the bollocks out of your radio stack as soon as you turn on the engine. However, in the sim, the 172 couldn't give two squirts of frozen jizz for whatever order you turn everything on. Navigation systems are not fully fleshed out, and many of the multi-engined aircraft have multitudes of buttons that are inoperable. This is not as bad as it sounds. This is actually quite normal and perfectly acceptable in flight sims. Study-level aircraft sometimes take years to produce and therefore carry a premium price tag. So the way it works in flight sims is if you want a particular study-level aircraft, you buy it from a third-party developer as an add-on. This is perfectly normal. You'll be pleased to hear most of the controls perform immaculately, with the exception of the fucking trim, which has the sensitivity of one's scrotum after a deep massage with a belt sander. It's positively fucking irritating. You bind a control to it, a little touch, nothing happens. Touch it a picosecond longer than your last attempt and the trim wheel freewheels like a fucking spinning top, sending you hurtling skywards like the fucking space shuttle or into the dirt like a 737 MAX. Apart from the trim, which in all honesty I hope has led to someone in Seattle hanging by their foreskin from a fish hook over, all of the other controls perform really well. The aircraft are quite believable in how they handle, they're just a little bit bland and don't have the individual quirks one would expect. But overall they've done a pretty decent job. Aesthetically the aircraft look amazing. Just look at these cockpits. They're beautiful. The controls, gauges, buttons and knobs giggity. You have real-time reflections in all reflective surfaces and nothing is baked in. Look at the dashboards, the lighting, everything is new, everything sparkles and shines. The externals look just as good and I have to say that these are the best visual representation of aircraft I've seen in a civilian flight sim. Both Microsoft and ASBO have done an outstanding job here, top marks. Your next question is probably, what aircraft do I get? Well, here's a list of aircraft for all three versions. Now I know what you're thinking. You've got a horn for one particular aircraft, so that's the version you're going to buy. Steady on there. You see, at some point in the future, a study version of the aircraft you have a horn for will probably appear as a third-party add-on. So the point is, just because it's on the list, it doesn't automatically mean you should buy that version. I'll get to that when summing up. We need to have a chat about the one constant in the sim, ATC. Yes, him. Oh, surely you mean they, Lao B, I can hear you ask. Well, no, I mean him. It's one guy. He's omnipresent. Hand off at Houston, contact Tower at Galveston a second later and he's there waiting for you. I'd advise anyone who has ever suffered from hallucinatory experiences, other than substance related of course, and the clinically bewildered in general to avoid this sim at the moment. You're going to feel like you're being stalked. This is also a problem in the other major civilian sim, but for fuck's sake Microsoft, you're global. It would have taken an hour tops to find 2 locals to read the NATO phonetic alphabet, 20 sample phrases, and the numbers 0 to 9. All you needed were 3 or 4 people from each country. I'm sure you could have even found volunteers to do it for free. What's really annoying is the guy you hired sounds like the same fucker from the other sim. The thing is, ATC is quite good. It has ATIS, ground services, they'll sometimes provide you with detailed instructions for taxi, other times they leave you to figure it out for yourself because they're too busy sucking off an air steward or whatever they do when they're not being pricks to pilots. And before you ask, I'm pretty sure it's the same prick, he's just holding his nose. When flying IFR, the handoffs between airspaces are quite decent, but it's the same guy, and he's not even bothering his hole to try to convince you otherwise. The problem is you begin to hate him. I'm sure he's a great guy, he probably takes care of stray dogs on his days off and always tips at the whorehouse. But after a couple of hundred nagging reminders, you're ready to go postal on that control tower. In terms of how it performs, the sim can be a little schizophrenic. At high and ultra settings you have some of the most beautiful terrain available in flight sims, the weather is doing something interesting, it looks beautiful, and the sim will canter along at a steady 40 to 50 FPS. That's in a built-up area like Tokyo here. Sometimes over less built-up but equally beautiful and detailed terrain you can hit 70 FPS or more. However, there will be random annoying stutters as it loads in terrain, even on a good connection. I can't help but feel if it spent a little longer filling up the cache and pre-rendering, the experience wouldn't be quite as jarring. It seems to load in detail in 3 to 5 kilometer blocks. If you're quick enough and just look the other way at the right time, you can sometimes catch it building scenery before your bloodshot eyes. Overall it performs well, in some areas it performs magnificently. The weather can be chucking plagues of apocalyptic proportions at your aircraft and the sim will continue on at a good rate. However, there is a catch. That's in a 152, a Dior 400 or any other single engine, GA or sport plane. Add an extra engine or 3 and observe. As I've said, for my examples I've used one of the most beautifully detailed areas in the sim, Tokyo. Here in a 152 I'm at about 50 to 60 FPS of KY smooth goodness. The 172 G1000 takes a small hit, but it's still perfectly comfortable at 45 to 50 FPS. Add an engine and watch it turn into vomit-inducing hell. One extra engine, a fucking Beechcraft. It shits itself, dropping to 30, 20, 18, stutters, gets its shit back together again and then back to 30. However, if you really want to combine vertigo and bulimia, try the Airbus. It has all the fluidity of an orgy on a Parkinson's ward. What's completely befuddling and perhaps feeding into the problem to some extent is Microsoft and Hasbro are using DX11. Microsoft have been pimping DX12 for years. This is like having a Learjet but opting to fly Ryanair because you miss the obese air hostesses and abject humiliation. I really feel the sim needed another couple of months in beta prior to release. I would have accepted this from a smaller dev, but this is fucking Microsoft and a flagship product. It still looks great and performs really well, but these little issues should have been ironed out. If you love GA and sport aircraft, and I do, your problems are going to be as few as a Twitch streamer's qualifications. But I also want to play the bigger aircraft that you can get to fly in real life. As a result, so far my endeavours to this end have been a slow stuttering slideshow, like watching geriatrics fuck under a strobe light. I'm going to be a tad confrontational here, but I do believe it's necessary. So please remember, if this hurts your sensibilities or you feel the need to white knight your favourite social media grand wizard, the red X is still in the corner of that window and you're free to use it. I'm not a 60 FPS all the way queen, but 30 is practically unacceptable in a flight sim. There are some wretched pricks out there who will tell you 30 FPS is fine or even very good for a flight sim. They're talking through their holes, of course. At best they're gobshites, and at worst they're being disingenuous cum dumpsters, and here's why. You're entering the runway at Incestville, Alabama. 30 FPS in your chosen aircraft, real-world traffic, weather and multiplayer are on. There are 2 aircraft in a circuit and 1 in long final. Then a couple of players join in. In any flight sim one can expect a moderate FPS hit. If you're up 40 to 50 it'll take you down to somewhere in the low 30s. However, if you're approaching rotation speed at 30 FPS, that could tank you down to 18 to 20, turning your experience into something akin to a 50s B-movie stop-motion animation sequence. So the next time you hear some pompous cock-end tell you that 30 FPS is perfectly good in a flight sim, tell them to suck a bag of dicks and close the video. On the subject of videos, please be aware that gaming and online journalists are generally not real journalists. In fact, the term online journalist is generally just a byword for unemployable bella and living off hipster welfare. Please also remember that Microsoft are well known for their lavish press junkets. The combination of the aforementioned factors can have a detrimental effect on the thoroughness of online reviews, particularly when one considers the aforementioned unemployable bellends have probably neither studied journalism nor even picked up a book on ethics in journalism. When most of these oxygen thieves are wined and dined, they have a tendency to feel more than slightly beholden to their generous benefactors, to the point where they feel the need to figuratively fillet such a benefactor with platitude-filled reviews. This used to be known by the Latin term quid pro quo. In this case it's more like quid pro blow. This of course is not the fault of Microsoft, it's the result of allowing any idiot who can toss a word salad on a website to declare themselves a member of a once venerable profession. I mean, let's face it, if I could get away with labelling myself a gynecologist, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. To sum up this little section, it's your money. It's better to spend an hour doing some research than to spend years whining on the forums. Now we've arrived at the question posed in the title of the video. Well, that's actually 3 questions with a number of caveats. I'll explain. You see, there are 3 versions of this sim available for purchase. Standard priced at 60 shekels, Deluxe priced at 90 shekels, and Premium Deluxe priced at 120 shekels. So as you can see from the list, in the Standard Edition you get 20 aircraft and 30 handcrafted airports. In the Deluxe Edition you get an extra 5 of each, and in the Premium Edition you get an extra 10 of each. Now remember, in the Standard Edition you will still have all the same airports including runways and taxiways as the other editions, you'll just be missing out on 5 or 10 sets of handcrafted airport buildings, so you may not see the sign saying welcome to Bumfuckville. So when it comes to airports, the only reason you buy anything else but Standard is if you want to have all the buildings modelled for one or some of the airports in the other list. Perhaps it's not airports, perhaps you have a real boner for one of the aircraft in the other versions. As I explained earlier, all of the aircraft are at a survey sim level. At some stage, probably in the near future, a third-party developer is going to release a full study version of the aircraft. So what's the point in throwing an extra 30 or 60 shekels at the base game when you can use that for 1 or 2 of your favourite aircraft in all their glory? The other major caveat is your system. If your system doesn't meet or exceed recommended specs, forget about it. Remember, the unique selling points for this sim are the beautiful visuals, live maps and weather. You can avail of decent quality airports and aircraft in any civilian sim. Speaking of live terrain and weather, you also need a pretty decent internet connection. If you don't meet or exceed all of the aforementioned, this sim is going to be more frustrating than trying to finger fuck a hot girl while wearing boxing gloves. By the way, you can also avail of this sim for free on the Xbox Live Gaming Pass, which costs around 10 shekels a month. This rather neatly brings me on to a perennial bugbear of mine, gaming as a service. I am not a fan of gaming as a service. This is not quite a gaming as a service title, but it certainly has strong gaming as a service elements. The problem with buying into gaming as a service is you run the same risks as those investing in MMOs. Income slows, middle management run out of cocaine and trafficked runaways, and before you know it they make a decision to cut back on the servers, resulting in you logging in one day and witnessing that beautiful terrain downloading line by line like late 90s porn. Before I finish, there is one other thing worth mentioning. VR has not yet come to this sim, but they have said they're planning it for later. In my view, there are still a lot of issues to straighten out before they can make VR a reality, so if you're solely a VR player, I'd suggest waiting a while. So is it worth buying? Standard edition? Fuck yeah. Premium or deluxe? Unless you're compelled by a hatred of money? Fuck no. And on that note, I thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to dislike or tell me to go bing myself below.